Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadows of medieval times where justice was swift, punishment was brutal, and the line between hero and monster often blurred like fog over a castle moat. You find yourself walking through cobblestone streets lit only by flickering torchlight, where the screams echoing from stone towers might be executions or celebrations. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference. The air smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and fear, because in this world, law enforcement is whatever the nearest nobleman decides it should be. And criminals don't just steal your purse, they might steal your entire village. This is a time when legends are born from blood-soaked reality, when a warlord's cruelty becomes a cautionary tale whispered for centuries, and when the worst human impulses had very few boundaries to contain them. You're about to meet figures whose names still send shivers down spines 6, 7, even 800 years later. These aren't your garden variety pickpockets or highwaymen, though we'll meet a few of those too. No, these are the individuals whose crimes were so spectacular, so horrifying, or so audacious that history couldn't forget them even if it wanted to. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why vampire legends took such deep root in Eastern Europe, or why certain castles remain abandoned even when prime real estate is hard to find. So before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what historical period fascinates you most. Maybe you're tucked in bed in Tokyo, or perhaps you're winding down after a long shift in Toronto. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional. And let's embark on tonight's journey together. You need to understand something about medieval crime before we go any further. It existed in a world without fingerprints, without DNA evidence, without surveillance cameras or forensic laboratories. A criminal's greatest weapon wasn't just their blade or their poison, it was the sheer difficulty of catching them in an age when communication travelled at the speed of a horse, when borders were vague suggestions, and when a person could reinvent themselves simply by walking to the next kingdom. The most notorious criminals of medieval times weren't just evil, they were often clever, well-connected, or so powerful that the usual rules simply didn't apply to them. Consider that in many medieval societies, nobility operated under entirely different legal systems than commoners. A nobleman accused of murder might face trial by combat or pay a fine, while a peasant caught stealing a loaf of bread could hang. This two-tiered justice system meant that some of history's worst criminals wore crowns, commanded armies, or celebrated mass in cathedrals. They committed atrocities that would make modern serial killers look like amateurs, yet they did so with the full protection of their social status, at least until their crimes became so egregious that even medieval society's high tolerance for violence was finally exceeded. The medieval period spans roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome around 476 CE to the beginning of the Renaissance in the 1400s, though different regions entered and exited the medieval era at different times. We're going to roam across this vast timeline and even dip into the ancient world and early modern period when the most compelling villains demand it. From the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked fortresses of Persia, from the frozen principalities of Eastern Europe to the tropical waters of the South China Sea, criminals found ways to terrorize, manipulate, and murder on scales both intimate and epic. You're probably wondering what makes someone notorious rather than simply criminal. It's a good question, and the answer reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. Notoriety requires an audience, a story that spreads, a legend that grows in the telling. The criminals you'll meet tonight didn't just commit crimes. They committed crimes so shocking, so excessive, or so perfectly tailored to the fears of their era that people couldn't stop talking about them. Some became bogeymen used to frighten children into obedience. Others became darkly romantic figures, their brutality somehow transformed into a twisted kind of charisma by the passage of centuries. Historians still argue whether some of these figures were quite as terrible as their reputations suggest, or whether their enemies exaggerated their crimes for political purposes. Medieval chroniclers weren't exactly committed to objective journalism. They had axes to grind, patrons to please, and moral lessons to teach. A political enemy could easily become a monster in the historical record, their actual crimes embellished with fantastical elements to make them seem less than human. Yet even accounting for exaggeration and propaganda, the core truth remains. The medieval world produced criminals whose genuine deeds were horrifying enough without any embellishment necessary. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, remember that these stories come from a time when darkness was truly dark, when forests were genuinely dangerous, and when the knock on your door after sunset might be your last visitor ever. Sweet dreams. You're going to need them. You stand in the Loire Valley of France in the year 1440, outside a massive stone fortress that rises like a dark promise against the autumn sky. This is the castle of Gilles de Rais, and if you'd arrived here a decade earlier, you would have seen one of the most celebrated knights in all of Christendom, a man who fought alongside Joan of Arc herself, a hero of France who helped drive the English from Orleans. Now you see something else entirely, a fortress where the screams of children echo through corridors decorated with the finest tapestries money can buy, where wealth and depravity have merged into something that will haunt the French countryside for generations. Gilles de Rais was born into Breton nobility around 1405, inheriting vast estates that made him one of the wealthiest men in France. He fought with distinction in the 100 Years' War, earning the title of Marshal of France before he turned 25. The young Gilles cut a dashing figure, tall, dark-haired, pious in public and generous with his money. He sponsored religious festivals, funded church construction, and lived with the kind of extravagance that would make modern billionaires blush. His castle entertainments featured elaborate theatrical productions with casts of hundreds, musicians imported from across Europe, and feasts that lasted for days. But you notice something strange about this castle as you move through its memories. Children from the surrounding villages keep disappearing, peasant boys mostly, the kind of children no one important would miss. A son sent to beg at the castle gates never returns home. A young apprentice delivering supplies vanishes. At first, parents assume their children have run away or been taken by wolves or fallen into rivers. Medieval life is dangerous for everyone, but especially for the poor and young. It takes years before the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, before whispered rumors begin to suggest that something unspeakable is happening behind those castle walls. What Gilles de Rais did in those walls is difficult to describe without crossing into territory too dark for a peaceful night's rest, so we'll tread carefully here. The historical record, drawn from his eventual trial testimony, indicates that he lured children to his castle under various pretexts, offering them food, promising employment, or simply having his servants abduct them from the roads. What followed involved torture, sexual abuse, and murder on a scale that shocked even the hardened clergy who eventually investigated him. Historians estimate anywhere from 40 to several hundred victims over nearly a decade, though the exact number will never be known. Here's where the story gets complicated in that uniquely medieval way. Gilles wasn't caught because of his crimes against children, at least not directly. He was brought down by a combination of massive debt and political overreach. His extravagant lifestyle had burned through even his enormous fortune, forcing him to sell off properties and estates. In desperation, he turned to alchemy and occult practices, hoping to transmute base metals into gold or summon demons who might restore his wealth. One of his alchemist advisors was a conman named François Prelati, who kept promising results while draining what remained of Gilles' funds. Medieval folks loved a good demon story almost as much as they loved a good murder mystery. The final straw came when Gilles, in a fit of rage over a property dispute, kidnapped a priest and ransacked a church, a serious offence even for a nobleman. This gave the Duke of Brittany and the Bishop of Nantes the opening they needed to arrest and try him. Only during the investigation into these crimes did the full horror of what had been happening at his various estates come to light. Servants testified. Parents of missing children were finally heard. The physical evidence found in his castles was reportedly so disturbing that even the medieval investigators were shaken. Historians still argue whether Gilles' confession was entirely voluntary or extracted through the threat of torture and excommunication, concerns about due process that seem almost quaint given the magnitude of the crimes described. Some scholars suggest his occult practices and theatrical interests might have been exaggerated to make him seem more monstrous, transforming a serial killer into a demon-worshipping sorcerer for maximum propaganda effect. The medieval church loved connecting sexual deviance, murder, and devil worship into one tidy package of evil. At his trial in October 1440, Gilles de Rais confessed to his crimes in graphic detail, weeping and asking for forgiveness. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging and burning. In a strange gesture of mercy considering his crimes, the church allowed him to be executed before his body was burned, sparing him the agony of burning alive, a consideration not typically extended to condemned criminals. Thousands gathered to watch his execution, many reportedly praying for his soul, because even monsters could repent in medieval theology. You watch as his body is cut down before the flames consume it entirely, handed over to his family for burial in a Carmelite church. It's a controversy that sparks immediate debate. Should a child murderer rest in consecrated ground? But his family is powerful, and his repentance seemed genuine, and medieval Christianity holds that even the worst sinner can be saved through confession and contrition. It's a tension between justice and mercy that still resonates today, though modern societies generally come down on the justice side more firmly. The legend of Gilles de Rais would later inspire portions of the Bluebeard fairy tale, the wealthy nobleman whose castle hides terrible secrets, whose forbidden room contains the bodies of his victims. Some scholars even suggest his story influenced later vampire legends, this idea of a nobleman who feeds on the innocent behind castle walls. Whether these connections are direct or simply parallel evolution of folklore is debated, but the archetype is unmistakable: aristocratic evil, hidden wealth, and the victims no one powerful enough bothered to count. As you leave the Loire Valley and Gilles de Rais behind, you might reflect on how his story reveals something about medieval justice. It took kidnapping a priest to bring down a serial murderer of children. The lives of peasant boys weren't enough to move the machinery of law, but disrespecting the church and threatening noble property rights. That crosses a line even for the 15th century. It's a reminder that notoriety and justice don't always arrive together, and sometimes monsters wear the most respectable faces for years before anyone with power decides to look behind the mask. You find yourself traveling east now, across the medieval landscape toward the Carpathian Mountains, where the ground grows rougher and the forests darker. The year is 1462, and you're approaching Wallachia, a principality caught between the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the north, a buffer state where survival means being more terrifying than either of your powerful neighbors. The ruler here has a reputation that precedes him like the smell of death on the wind. His name is Vlad III, but history will remember him by his preferred method of execution, Vlad the Impaler. Before we go further into the darkness, let's acknowledge something that might help you sleep a tiny bit better tonight. Vlad Dracula, as he was also known, wasn't exactly the vampire Bram Stoker would later imagine. He was, however, absolutely a brutal warlord whose cruelty was so spectacular that it became the stuff of legend. The nickname Dracula comes from his father, Vlad II Dracul, who belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric organization devoted to defending Christianity against the Ottomans. Dracul means dragon, but it also means devil in Romanian, a convenient dual meaning that Vlad III seemed to embrace wholeheartedly. You need to understand the world Vlad was born into around 1431. Wallachia was a political nightmare, a throne that changed hands through assassination and betrayal more often than most people changed their clothes. Vlad's father was murdered. His older brother was tortured, blinded, and buried alive. Vlad himself spent years as a hostage of the Ottoman Sultan, a traumatic education in cruelty that he would later repay with interest. When he finally claimed the Wallachian throne in 1456, he had scores to settle and a principality to terrorize into submission. Medieval politics wasn't for the faint of heart, but Vlad took it to levels that made even his contemporaries uncomfortable. His signature punishment method, impalement, wasn't unique to him, but he perfected it into an art form that would make his name synonymous with horror. You watch as he orders wooden stakes prepared, not sharpened to a point but blunted enough to avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim would remain alive for hours or even days. The stake would be inserted through the body and planted in the ground, creating forests of dying people that could be seen for miles. Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans in his presence, impaled with the turbans nailed to their skulls. Merchants accused of cheating, impaled. Rival nobles, impaled. Saxon settlers who challenged his authority. Entire villages impaled, men, women and children arranged in geometric patterns around the town square. The numbers reported by contemporary chroniclers seem almost impossible. 20,000 impaled victims arranged outside the city of Targovist, creating a forest of the impaled that stretched for miles. When Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople himself, saw this gruesome display during his 1462 invasion, he reportedly turned his army around and went home. You don't conquer a man that crazy, the logic seemed to go. Historians still argue whether these numbers are accurate or exaggerated by chroniclers who loved a good horror story. But even conservative estimates put Vlad's body count in the thousands during his relatively brief periods of rule. Here's the thing that makes Vlad's story more complex than simple villainy. To the Romanian people, he's often considered a hero, a strong ruler who defended Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion and brought order to a chaotic principality. He was known for enforcing harsh justice against criminals and corrupt officials. One famous story, possibly apocryphal but revealing nonetheless, tells of a golden cup left at a public fountain in Targovist. The cup remained unstolen throughout Vlad's reign because everyone knew the penalty for theft was impalement. Crime rates probably plummeted when the punishment for stealing bread was being slowly killed in the town square over 3 days. Vlad's methods extended beyond impalement, though that remained his signature. He burned villages, boiled people alive, skinned them, and reportedly dined among forests of the impaled while dipping his bread in their blood. Whether that last detail is true or propaganda is debated, but it's the kind of detail that sticks in the historical record because it's so perfectly, horrifyingly visual. Medieval chroniclers knew that a good gruesome detail was worth 1,000 bland facts, and Vlad gave them plenty to work with. His downfall came not from his cruelty, but from the usual medieval cocktail of political betrayal and bad timing. Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, imprisoned him on dubious charges around 1462, possibly to avoid having to repay money he'd borrowed for anti-Ottoman campaigns. Vlad spent 12 years in a Hungarian prison, eventually converting to Catholicism and marrying into the Hungarian royal family, a remarkable comeback for a man who'd impaled thousands. He reclaimed the Wallachian throne briefly in 1476, but was killed in battle against the Ottomans within months. Even his death is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts say he was killed by the Ottomans. Others suggest his own men murdered him, mistaking him for an enemy, or perhaps seizing the opportunity to be rid of him. The legend of Vlad the Impaler would simmer in folklore for centuries before Bram Stoker stumbled across his story and merged it with vampire legends to create Count Dracula in 1897. Stoker probably chose the name for its exotic, vaguely menacing sound without knowing much about the historical Vlad, but the connection stuck. The real Vlad was far more terrifying than any supernatural creature because he was entirely human, a man who discovered that extreme cruelty could be an effective political tool in a medieval world where power projection meant making your enemies too afraid to challenge you. You stand now in the ruins of Poenari Castle, one of Vlad's mountain fortresses built by boyar prisoners who were worked to death in its construction. The wind howls through broken windows, and you can almost hear the echoes of screams that once filled these valleys. Vlad the Impaler represents a particular kind of medieval criminal, the warlord whose crimes were committed not in secret like Gilles de Rais, but in broad daylight as public policy, a man who turned brutality into statecraft and fear into a weapon more effective than any army. Whether you call him a monster or a medieval Machiavelli depends largely on which side of those stakes you would have been standing on, and that's probably the most uncomfortable truth of all. You leave the documented horrors of Eastern Europe behind and travel now to the misty coast of Scotland, where history begins to blur with legend in ways that make it nearly impossible to separate fact from folklore. The story you're about to hear might be the most debated in this entire catalogue of medieval criminals. A tale so gruesome that it's been told and retold for centuries, yet so lacking in concrete evidence that serious historians wonder if it ever happened at all. You're heading to a cave near Ballantrae in South Ayrshire, sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century, where a man named Sawney Bean supposedly led a clan of incestuous cannibals who terrorized travellers for 25 years. According to the legend that first appeared in broadsheets and chapbooks around the 18th century, notably more than 100 years after the events supposedly occurred, Alexander Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian, the son of a ditch digger and hedge trimmer. Young Sawney showed no interest in honest work, instead running off with a woman of similarly idle disposition. The pair settled in a coastal cave near Benane Head, a location so remote and treacherous that no one would think to search there, with an entrance that flooded during high tide, making it virtually invisible and accessible only during specific hours. Here's where the story descends into something that sounds more like a horror fairy tale than historical fact. Sawney and his wife supposedly began their life of crime by ambushing travellers on the lonely coastal roads, robbing them, and then, here's the part that stretches credulity, dragging the bodies back to their cave to butcher and eat, not out of starvation, mind you, but apparently as their preferred lifestyle choice. Over the years, the couple produced numerous children who never left the cave, never saw civilized society, and grew up knowing only the family business of murder and cannibalism. These children then bred with each other, producing grandchildren, and the clan eventually grew to 48 members, all living in this cave system, all sustaining themselves on human flesh. You peer into the darkness of that cave and try to imagine the scene described in the old pamphlets. Side chambers filled with pickled limbs, smoked haunches of human meat hanging from the ceiling, piles of stolen jewellery and clothing from hundreds of victims. The Bean clan allegedly became efficient hunters, working in coordinated groups to ambush travellers, sometimes attacking groups of 6 or more people if they had the numbers. Body parts would occasionally wash up on nearby beaches, leading to numerous innocent people being arrested, tried and executed for the crimes. while the real culprits remained hidden in their seaside lair. The story reaches its climax when a man and his wife are attacked by the clan while returning from a fair. The husband, being well armed and mounted, manages to fight off the attackers long enough for a larger group of travellers to arrive, scaring the beans back into hiding. But not before the man's wife has been pulled from her horse, killed and, in the most grotesque detail of a grotesque story, partially consumed before his eyes. This survivor reports the attack to the local magistrate, who in turn informs King James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England. The king, intrigued and horrified, supposedly leads a manhunt of 400 men with bloodhounds to track down these coastal predators. The dogs eventually find the cave entrance during low tide, and the hunting party enters to discover a scene from hell itself. The aforementioned body parts, the wild-eyed clan members who've never known civilization, and evidence of 25 years of systematic murder and cannibalism. The Bean clan is captured without much resistance, though some versions of the story claim they fought viciously. They're transported to Edinburgh where, in keeping with the medieval sense of proportional justice, they're executed without trial. The men have their hands and feet cut off and are left to bleed to death while the women and children are forced to watch. Then the women and children are burned alive. It's barbarism answering barbarism, horror matching horror, and the story ends with the complete extermination of the Bean line. Now here's where you need to sit up slightly and engage your critical thinking, even at this sleepy hour. Historians still argue whether any of this actually happened, and the evidence for the no camp is fairly compelling. There are no contemporary records of the Bean family, no court documents, no official records of their capture or execution, no entries in the parish registers of the region. The first written account appears in the early 1700s, decades after the supposed events, in sensationalist broadsheets known for fabricating or embellishing stories to boost sales. Think of them as the tabloid newspapers of their day, not exactly bastions of journalistic integrity. The story has all the hallmarks of a moral panic fable or anti-Scottish propaganda, possibly circulated by English sources during periods of tension between Scotland and England. It hits every note designed to horrify a civilized audience. Incest, cannibalism, the complete rejection of Christianity and society, the corruption of children, and the transformation of humans into something less than animals. It's almost too perfectly horrifying, which is usually a sign that a story has been crafted rather than recorded. Some scholars suggest it might be based on a real family of bandits or murderers whose crimes were exaggerated into legend, while others believe it's entirely fictional, a cautionary tale about what happens when people reject society's rules. Yet the legend persists with remarkable tenacity, appearing in collections of Scottish history, true crime books, and now apparently in sleepy history videos designed to send you gently into dreams or nightmares depending on how this is going. The Sawney Bean story reveals something about what terrifies us beyond simple violence. It's the idea of humans becoming inhuman, of families becoming monsters, of civilization being just a thin veneer that can be stripped away by isolation and evil. The fact that it probably didn't happen doesn't make it less revealing about our fears. You leave the coast of Scotland now, the cave mouth disappearing behind you as the tide rolls in, hiding the entrance once again. Whether Sawney Bean was real or imagined, his story has achieved a kind of immortality that most historical criminals never reach. He's become an archetype, the monster in the cave, the family of cannibals, the horror hiding just off the familiar road. Sometimes the legends we tell reveal more truth about human nature than the facts ever could, even if the legend itself is built on nothing more substantial than mist and imagination, and the very human need to believe that somewhere out there someone is even worse than we are. You travel now eastward again to Hungary in the early 1600s, where the Carpathian Mountains cast long shadows over a land still recovering from Ottoman invasions and internal strife. In a castle perched high above the village of Kaktisi, a noblewoman prepares for her evening rituals. She is Countess Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most powerful women in Hungary, descended from kings and princes, married into further wealth and influence. She is also, if the accounts are to be believed, one of history's most prolific serial killers, a woman whose name would become synonymous with vanity, cruelty, and the legend of bathing in blood to preserve youth. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Hungary. Her uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousins included princes and cardinals. She received an excellent education unusual for women of her time, learning to read and write in several languages. At 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his fierce campaigns against the Ottomans. The marriage brought together two great fortunes and resulted in Elizabeth managing vast estates while her husband was away at war for years at a time. She was, by all accounts, an intelligent and capable administrator, respected by her tenants and peers alike, at least in the early years of her marriage. The first whispers of trouble began circulating after her husband's death in 1604. With no husband to answer to and immense power at her disposal, Elizabeth's behaviour allegedly became increasingly erratic and cruel. The accusations that would eventually emerge painted a picture of systematic torture and murder that lasted for years, possibly decades. Young peasant girls from the surrounding villages were lured to the castle with promises of employment as servants or seamstresses, only to disappear behind those stone walls never to be seen again. Some came from impoverished families desperate for any income. Others were effectively kidnapped, taken from villages on Elizabeth's lands where her word was law and no one dared question the Countess. What supposedly happened to these girls within the castle walls reads like a catalogue of medieval torture methods. The testimonies collected during the eventual investigation describe whipping, burning with hot irons, freezing girls in courtyards during winter, and dousing them with water until they became ice statues, forcing needles under fingernails, and cutting flesh with scissors and knives. Elizabeth allegedly had a specially designed Iron Maiden-like cage called the Iron Virgin, where a girl could be locked inside while spikes slowly pressed into her flesh. Some accounts claim Elizabeth would bite chunks of flesh from her victims' faces and bodies, earning her comparisons to vampires alongside Vlad Dracula in later folklore. The most famous element of the Elizabeth Bathory legend is the blood bathing, the claim that she murdered young women and bathed in their blood, believing it would preserve her beauty and youth. It's a striking image that has dominated her story in popular culture, appearing in countless films, books, and articles. Here's the thing though, this particular detail doesn't appear in the original trial documents or contemporary accounts. It was added to the story decades later, possibly borrowed from earlier folklore about other figures, and then retrofitted onto Elizabeth's legend because it was too cinematically perfect to resist. Historians still argue whether she ever actually bathed in blood, or whether this was a later embellishment that transformed a serial killer into something more mythologically monstrous. What isn't in dispute based on the trial records that do survive is that something terrible was happening at Cactus Castle. By 1610, the rumours had grown too loud to ignore, even for a woman of Elizabeth's station. The investigation was led by György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, and actually a cousin of Elizabeth's by marriage. This wasn't some random witch hunt by enemies, but a reluctant inquiry by family members who couldn't ignore the evidence any longer. When Thurzo's men raided the castle on December 30th, 1610, they reportedly found one girl dead and others imprisoned and injured, some waiting for torture sessions that would never come now that the castle had been breached. The subsequent investigation collected testimony from dozens of witnesses, servants, villagers, local officials, and some of Elizabeth's own accomplices. The numbers of victims claimed vary wildly depending on the source. Some witnesses testified to 36 or 37 deaths. Others claim to have seen a register in Elizabeth's own handwriting listing over 600 victims, though this register was never produced as evidence and may have been fabricated testimony. Modern historians generally estimate the victim count somewhere between 30 and 100, which is still horrifying enough without the exaggerated numbers. 4 of Elizabeth's servants were put on trial for their complicity: 2 women, a man, and a dwarf who served as a procurer of victims. They were found guilty and executed with medieval thoroughness. 2 had their fingers torn out with hot pincers before being thrown alive into a fire. The other 2 were beheaded and then burned. Elizabeth herself, however, never faced a public trial. Her immense social status and family connections made a public trial politically impossible. Too many powerful people were related to her, and the scandal would have been devastating to Hungary's ruling class. Instead, she was placed under house arrest in her own castle, walled up in a small set of rooms with only slits for food and air. She remained in this imprisonment for nearly 4 years until her death in August 1614, at age 54. Some accounts say she showed no remorse, maintaining her innocence to the end. Others claim she went mad in her confinement, though how anyone would have known given her isolation is unclear. She was buried in the Bathory family crypt, though local villagers objected so strenuously to having her buried in their church that her body was eventually moved to her birthplace. Even in death, she remained controversial. The question that keeps historians debating centuries later is how much of the Elizabeth Bathory story is true and how much is exaggerated or fabricated. She had powerful enemies who stood to gain from her downfall. Her estates were valuable, and she held debts from numerous nobles who would benefit from her disgrace. The trial was conducted without her participation or defense. Some modern scholars suggest she was the victim of a conspiracy, her crimes exaggerated or invented to justify seizing her property. The fact that she was never given a chance to defend herself publicly does raise questions about due process, even by medieval standards. Yet the testimony from servants and villagers is extensive and consistent in its descriptions of cruelty and murder, even if the exact numbers are disputed. It seems unlikely that dozens of witnesses would all fabricate similar stories without some basis in reality. The most probable truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere between the extremes. Elizabeth Bathory was likely a murderer who killed multiple young women, but probably not the 600-victim vampire countess of legend. Nor was she an entirely innocent woman framed by scheming men. She was a powerful noblewoman whose cruelty toward those beneath her social station eventually exceeded even the high tolerance for violence that medieval Hungarian nobility enjoyed. You stand now in the ruins of Kaktis Castle, mostly destroyed over the centuries, reclaimed slowly by the forest. The wind carries no screams anymore, just the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of modern traffic from the village below. Elizabeth Bathory's story has become inseparable from vampire mythology, from Gothic horror, from cultural anxieties about female power and vanity. Whether she bathed in blood or not, her legend certainly has, soaked in centuries of retelling, each generation adding new details, stripping away others, until the woman herself is almost invisible beneath the myth. And perhaps that's the real horror, not knowing where the truth ends and the nightmare begins, and realizing that the truth alone was probably terrible enough. You step backward now through time, leaving the medieval castles behind and traveling to ancient Rome, to the imperial court of Nero in the 1st century CE. Yes, we're bending our timeline a bit, but some criminals are too notorious to ignore, and Locusta the Poisoner represents a type of criminal that would flourish throughout the medieval period and beyond, the professional assassin, the one who kills not from passion or madness, but as a business transaction. Locusta was Rome's most infamous poisoner, a woman whose services were sought by emperors themselves, and whose story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones the powerful keep on retainer. We know frustratingly little about Locusta's early life. She appears in the historical record fully formed as an adult, already established as a master poisoner in Rome around 54 CE. Some sources suggest she came from Gaul, that she learned herbalism and toxicology from druids or local wise women. But these details might be Roman prejudice talking. Foreigners and women, both being convenient scapegoats for mysterious deaths, in a society that loved conspiracy theories almost as much as gladiator fights. What we do know is that by the time she enters history's spotlight, she's already been arrested and condemned to death for poisoning multiple people, presumably for profit. Here's where her story gets interesting in that uniquely Roman way. While awaiting execution, Locusta receives an unusual visitor, representatives of Agrippina the Younger, the ambitious mother of the future Emperor Nero and current wife of Emperor Claudius. Agrippina has a problem, you see. Her husband Claudius is in reasonably good health, but her son Nero can only become emperor if Claudius conveniently dies before naming someone else as heir. She needs a poisoner, and word on the street is that Locusta is the best in the business. So instead of being executed, Locusta finds herself pardoned and hired for the highest stakes contract killing imaginable, assassinating a sitting Roman emperor. The poison Locusta prepares for Claudius is administered through his favorite dish of mushrooms, supposedly by his food taster Halotus, who is in on the conspiracy. Historians still argue whether Claudius actually died from poison or from natural causes. He was in his 60s, had numerous health problems, and ancient Romans had a tendency to blame poison for any unexpected death among the powerful. But the ancient sources are fairly consistent. Claudius ate his mushrooms, fell violently ill, and died on October 13th, 54 CE. Nero became emperor at age 16, and Locusta became the imperial poisoner, protected by the most powerful person in the known world. You watch as Locusta sets up her operation with imperial backing. She's given a villa, assistance, and complete legal immunity to practice her craft. She becomes a kind of dark scientist, testing poisons on slaves and condemned prisoners to perfect her formulations, keeping detailed records of symptoms, dosages, and death times. It's methodical, almost medical in its precision, which somehow makes it more chilling than passionate violence. She's not killing from anger or madness. She's experimenting, refining her craft, treating murder as a technical problem to be solved with the right chemical solution. Her next major commission comes from Nero himself in 55 CE. The young emperor wants his stepbrother Britannicus dead, Britannicus being the biological son of Claudius, and thus having a potentially stronger claim to the throne than Nero. Locusta prepares a poison, but the first attempt fails. Britannicus survives the initial dose, much to Nero's fury. In a scene that reveals just how casually Imperial Rome treated assassination, Nero reportedly has Locusta brought to his private rooms and personally supervises, while she prepares a more potent version, testing it on animals until he's satisfied with the speed and reliability of the result. The second attempt succeeds spectacularly. At a family dinner, Britannicus drinks from a cup and within minutes collapses, dying in front of the assembled guests, including his own mother. The ancient historian Tacitus describes the scene. Some guests freeze in shock, others flee, and Nero calmly continues eating, explaining that Britannicus simply had an epileptic seizure, nothing to worry about, please continue with the meal. It's the kind of casual psychopathy that makes you grateful you're just visiting this time period in your imagination, rather than living through it as a potential victim. Locusta's services continue to be in demand throughout Nero's reign. She becomes a kind of state-sponsored serial killer, eliminating political inconveniences, disposing of wealthy targets whose estates Nero wants to confiscate, and training others in the art of poisoning. Some sources claim she ran a school for poisoners, teaching her techniques to carefully selected students, creating an entire network of assassins operating under imperial protection. Whether this school actually existed or is historical embellishment is debated, but it's a detail too delicious for later writers to resist including. The protection Locusta enjoyed under Nero demonstrates something important about how crime and power interact. She was a known murderer, a serial killer by any definition, yet she lived in comfort and security because she was useful to the emperor. Medieval nobles would employ similar figures, poisoners, assassins, enforcers, who committed crimes with complete impunity as long as they served the powerful. The law, such as it existed, applied to common criminals, but seemed to have exceptions written for those who killed on behalf of the state or the ruling class. Locusta's charmed life ended abruptly when Nero committed suicide in 68 CE, during the year of 4 emperors, when Rome descended into civil war. The new emperor Galba, wanting to distance himself from Nero's excesses and probably terrified of having an expert poisoner wandering around Rome, had Locusta arrested. She was executed publicly, reportedly suffering rape by a specially trained giraffe before being torn apart by wild animals in the arena, a particularly degrading and spectacular death designed to satisfy the mob's bloodlust and send a message about what happens to those who serve tyrants, Roman justice theatre at its finest or worst, depending on your perspective. The historical sources for Locusta come mainly from Tacitus, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, all writing years after the events, all with their own biases and agendas. Some modern historians question whether Locusta was as influential as portrayed, or whether she became a convenient scapegoat for imperial murders that may have been conducted by others, or resulted from natural causes wrongly attributed to poison. Ancient Rome was paranoid about poisoning in the way medieval Europe would later be paranoid about witchcraft, seeing it everywhere, often without solid evidence. Yet even if some details are exaggerated, Locusta clearly existed and clearly practiced murder as a profession. She represents a particular type of criminal that transcends any specific era, the one who weaponizes specialized knowledge, who kills without passion as a technical exercise, who serves power rather than challenging it. In medieval times, there would be poisoners in every major court, herbalists whose knowledge of healing could just as easily be turned to killing, alchemists who understood both medicine and murder. They were the silent killers, the ones who made death look like illness, who left no blade wounds or obvious violence, just bodies that stopped breathing and grieving families who never knew the truth. You leave ancient Rome behind now, the imperial court fading into history's long shadow. Locusta the poisoner has been dead for nearly 2,000 years, but her professional descendants would ply their trade throughout the medieval period and beyond. Every royal court, every ambitious noble, every power struggle created demand for someone willing to kill cleanly, quietly, and deniably. The poison in the wine, the toxic herb in the stew, the lethal powder in the medicine. These were the weapons of the patient killer, the one who understood that sometimes the most effective crimes are the ones nobody realizes are crimes at all, just unfortunate tragedies that conveniently benefit someone powerful enough to remain above suspicion. You journey now to India, to a subcontinent of vast distances and ancient roads where traders and pilgrims travel between cities carrying goods and offerings, where the dusty highways are arteries of commerce and faith. But these roads harbour a particular danger that will persist for centuries, a criminal organisation so widespread, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of society, that entire generations will be born, live and die in service to murder as a religious calling. You're about to encounter the Thuggee, the devotees of the goddess Kali who killed travelers not just for profit but as acts of worship, and who may represent the most successful criminal organization in human history, if measured by longevity and body count. The word Thuggee comes from the Hindi word thag, meaning deceiver or swindler, which itself may derive from the Sanskrit sthaga, meaning scoundrel or cheat. These weren't your typical bandits who attacked travelers with weapons and fled. The Thuggee operated with far more sophistication, infiltrating groups of travelers by posing as fellow pilgrims or merchants, gaining their trust over days or weeks of shared travel, and then ritually strangling them at a predetermined moment using a weighted yellow or white cloth called a rumal. The killing was done according to precise religious protocols, the bodies buried in specific ways, and the proceeds of robbery divided according to intricate hierarchical rules. It was murder as liturgy, crime as sacrament. Historical records suggest the Thuggee had been operating for centuries before the British East India Company began seriously documenting them in the early 1800s. Some accounts trace them back to the 13th century or earlier, making them a criminal enterprise that spanned potentially 600 years or more, far outlasting any modern organized crime syndicate. They operated across much of India, from the Deccan in the south to the Himalayan foothills in the north, with particular concentrations along major trade routes. Estimates of their annual victim count during their peak years range from a few hundred to several thousand, which over centuries could amount to hundreds of thousands or even millions of deaths. Historians still argue about these numbers, but even conservative estimates are staggering. What made the Thuggee so successful for so long was their integration into normal society. They weren't outlaws living in the wilderness. They were often respectable members of their communities, farmers, merchants, even minor officials who would leave for months at a time for the travelling season of robbery and murder, then return home to live peacefully until the next expedition. The practice was hereditary, passed from father to son, with boys being trained from childhood in the techniques of deception, strangulation, and grave digging. Entire families and even whole villages were involved, creating a code of silence that was nearly impossible to penetrate from outside. The religious element distinguished the Thuggee from common criminals. They saw themselves as devotees of Kali, the Hindu goddess associated with time, change, destruction, and power. Though it's crucial to note that mainstream Hinduism never sanctioned their practices, and most Hindus found the Thuggee as abhorrent as anyone else would. The Thuggee believed that Kali demanded human sacrifice, that each strangulation was an offering to the goddess, and that she in turn protected them from capture and granted them success in their endeavors. Before an expedition, they would perform religious ceremonies. The first murder of a journey required special rituals. They had sacred pickaxes for digging graves, consecrated cloths for strangling, and omens they would read to determine if conditions were favorable for killing. The actual method of murder was refined over generations into something chillingly efficient. A group of Thuggee would befriend travelers, sometimes journeying with them for days or weeks to allay any suspicions. When the moment was right, often at a prearranged location where Confederates had already dug graves, a signal would be given. One Thuggee would throw the rumal around the victim's neck, another would grab the legs, and a third would press on the chest or abdomen to prevent any cry for help. Death came within minutes. The bodies would be ritually mutilated, joints dislocated, sometimes dismembered, to prevent the spirits from seeking vengeance, then buried in graves that were carefully concealed. The Thuggee would then divide the loot according to complex rules that gave shares even to those who played minor roles like lookout or grave digger. You need to understand the scale and organization involved here. A typical Thuggee gang might include 20 to 50 members, with large expeditions involving over 100 men. They had scouts who identified promising targets, inveiglers who specialized in gaining victims' confidence, stranglers who performed the actual killings, gravediggers who disposed of bodies, and leaders who coordinated the entire operation. They used coded language to communicate, had networks of safe houses along major routes, and employed bribery and intimidation to keep local officials from investigating too closely. It was organized crime centuries before that term existed, sophisticated in ways that would impress modern criminal enterprises. The beginning of the end came when the British colonial administration, particularly William Sleeman, launched a comprehensive campaign against the Thuggee starting in the 1830s. Sleeman was a British soldier and administrator who became obsessed with destroying the Thuggee after realizing the scope of their operations. He employed a strategy that was remarkably effective, offering imprisoned Thuggee immunity or reduced sentences in exchange for testimony that would lead to the capture of other gang members. This created a cascade of informants that broke the code of silence that had protected the Thuggee for centuries. Between 1830 and 1850, British authorities arrested thousands of suspected Thuggee, executing hundreds and sentencing many more to life imprisonment or transportation. The campaign against the Thuggee was successful, but historians still argue about whether the British accounts of their activities were entirely accurate or exaggerated for colonial propaganda purposes. The British had incentives to portray India as a lawless land desperately in need of British governance and civilization. Some modern scholars suggest the Thuggee were a real phenomenon, but that their religious elements were overemphasized or misunderstood, that the British conflated several different criminal groups into one supposedly unified cult, and that the body counts were inflated to justify harsh colonial policing. It's a legitimate debate. Colonial records are always suspect, and the British certainly weren't above exaggerating threats to justify their presence. However, the existence of the Thuggee seems well documented enough by multiple independent sources, including Indian sources predating British intervention, to confirm that they were real, even if some details were embellished. The term thug entered English vocabulary directly from this phenomenon, becoming a generic word for any violent criminal, a linguistic legacy of this particular brand of Indian organized crime. The Thuggee represents something unique in criminal history, a multi-generational organization that combined religious devotion with systematic murder for profit, that operated openly as a kind of parallel society within mainstream Indian culture, and that succeeded far longer than it had any right to, simply because it was too strange, too organized, and too well protected by silence and complicity to be easily stopped. As you leave the dusty roads of India behind, you might reflect on what the Thuggee story reveals about criminal organization and society's blind spots. For centuries, thousands of people disappeared on Indian roads, and while individuals noticed and mourned, no one connected the dots into a systemic pattern until Sleeman forced the issue. Sometimes the most successful criminals are the ones who make their crimes look like isolated incidents rather than a coordinated campaign, who hide in plain sight by being just respectable enough in their daily lives that no one suspects the darkness they practice when they travel. The Thuggee understood this, and it kept them in business for longer than most nations survive. Sleep tight, and maybe be grateful that modern travel doesn't require quite as much trust in your fellow passengers as it once did. You find yourself back in medieval Europe now, in the forests and mountain passes that separate cities and kingdoms, where the rule of law grows thin beneath the canopy of ancient trees. These aren't the manicured nature preserves of the modern world. These are genuine wildernesses where wolves hunt, where roads are barely more than muddy tracks, and where travelers move in groups for safety because the woods belong to outlaws. Not all bandits achieved the romantic reputation of Robin Hood. that possibly fictional do-gooder who allegedly stole from the rich to give to the poor. Most medieval bandit kings were simply violent criminals who controlled territory through fear, extracted tribute from travelers and villagers, and built criminal empires that sometimes rivaled the legitimate nobility in power and wealth. The medieval period was practically designed to produce banditry on an industrial scale. You had constant warfare creating populations of displaced soldiers with military training and no employment. You had feudal systems that squeezed peasants with taxes and obligations, pushing desperate people toward crime. You had vast forests and mountainous regions where central authority barely reached, creating power vacuums that clever criminals could fill. And you had roads that were vital for commerce but difficult to patrol, creating a steady stream of vulnerable targets. It was a bandit's paradise, really, and certain individuals rose to prominence by organizing scattered outlaws into sophisticated criminal enterprises. Take Fulk Fitzwarren, an Anglo-Norman nobleman turned outlaw in the early 13th century, whose real-life exploits were later romanticized into something resembling the Robin Hood legend. Fulk was actually born into wealth and privilege. A knight who served King John of England before a property dispute led to him being declared an outlaw around 1200. Rather than submitting, Fulk took to the Welsh borderlands with his brothers and a growing band of followers, conducting what amounted to a guerrilla war against John's forces. He raided royal estates, ambushed tax collectors, and even allegedly captured and humiliated the king's representatives, all while evading capture for years. What made Fulk more than just a common brigand was his military skill and political connections. He had support from Welsh princes who were happy to see someone harassing the English king. He understood castle warfare and could conduct actual military operations rather than just highway robbery, and he eventually negotiated a pardon and had his lands restored in 1203. He's an example of how medieval banditry could shade into political rebellion, and how a man with the right connections could commit years of crimes and then simply buy or negotiate his way back into respectability. Medieval justice was flexible that way, especially for those born with noble blood. Further south in 14th century Italy, you encounter figures like Gino di Tacco, a nobleman from Siena who turned to banditry after his family was exiled for political reasons. Gino operated in the wild country between Siena and Rome, controlling mountain passes and extracting tolls from travelers. Protection money, essentially, though calling it tolls made it sound more legitimate. He became famous for his courtesy toward hostages, supposedly treating them well during captivity and releasing them after ransom was paid. Dante mentions him in the Divine Comedy, and Boccaccio includes a tale about him in the Decameron, where he kidnaps an abbot, cures his stomach ailment, and is eventually pardoned by the Pope. Historians still argue whether Gino was as charming as the stories suggest, or whether this was reputation management by a clever criminal who understood that good public relations meant victims were less likely to pursue blood feuds. In Germany during the 15th century you have Gotz von Berlichingen, a knight who lost his right hand in battle and had it replaced with a mechanical iron prosthetic that could grip a sword. After various political and legal troubles, Gotz turned to robber knight activities, essentially organized extortion and banditry dressed up in knightly respectability. He would feud with cities and merchants, which meant attacking their trade caravans and demanding payment to stop, operating in a grey area between legitimate noble warfare and straightforward highway robbery. His autobiography, written years after he'd been pardoned and retired, presents him as a romantic figure defending knightly values in a changing world, but contemporary victims probably saw him more as a violent extortionist with good armor and better legal arguments. What's striking about these bandit kings is how they operated at the intersection of crime and politics. Many came from the nobility or gentry, had military training, understood law well enough to exploit its loopholes, and had networks of supporters that extended into legitimate society. They controlled territories not through official appointment, but through force and negotiation, essentially running protection rackets on a geographic scale. Villages would pay them tribute to avoid being raided. Merchants would hire them as escorts, essentially paying the bandits to protect them from other bandits. Local nobles would look the other way or even covertly support them in exchange for help against rivals. It was a complex ecosystem where crime and governance blurred together. The forests of medieval Europe were genuinely dangerous places to travel, and not just because of bandits. You had wild animals, you had diseases, you had the simple logistical challenges of food and shelter. But bandits added a human element of calculated danger. Groups like the Folleville Gang in 14th century England conducted kidnappings, murders and robberies with impunity for years, protected by their connections to the local gentry and their willingness to serve as military muscle for nobles involved in political disputes. The Follevilles weren't romantic outlaws. They were violent criminals who happened to be useful enough to powerful people that they avoided serious consequences for most of their careers. In Spain, you had figures like Diego Corrientes in Andalusia during the 18th century. Yes, technically beyond our medieval period, but the bandit king tradition continued largely unchanged. Diego allegedly robbed rich travelers and distributed money to poor villagers, earning him a Robin Hood-style reputation. He was eventually captured and executed in 1781, and his story was romanticized almost immediately into folk hero status. Whether he actually helped the poor, or whether this was a legend created after his death to make his story more palatable is, of course, debated by historians who have learned to be skeptical of any criminal who supposedly only robbed bad people and never hurt innocents. The reality of medieval banditry was probably far less romantic than the legends suggest. Most bandits were desperate people who robbed whoever they could catch, showed little discrimination between rich and poor targets, and lived brutal, short lives that ended on gallows or in violent confrontations with authorities. The bandit kings, who achieved fame and even respectability, were exceptions, the ones clever or lucky or well-connected enough to survive and prosper. They understood that controlling territory and people required more than just violence. It required organization, intelligence networks, strategic thinking, and the ability to negotiate with legitimate powers when necessary. You stand now at a crossroads in a medieval forest, moonlight barely penetrating the canopy, and you hear sounds in the darkness. Could be deer, could be wolves, could be men with bows and bad intentions. The smart traveller in this era joined a caravan, hired guards, travelled during daylight, and paid whatever tolls or bribes were necessary to reach their destination. The medieval world had no 911 to call, no police to investigate robberies, no forensic science to track down criminals. If you were robbed or killed on a lonely road, your body might lie there until animals scattered your bones, just another forgotten victim of the bandits who turned vast swaths of Europe into their personal fiefdoms. The bandit kings lived well while they lived, ruled their forest kingdoms with absolute authority, and sometimes, if they were clever and lucky enough, eventually traded their criminal empires for pardons, pensions, and respectability. Not all criminals end badly, especially in an age when power and legitimacy were negotiable concepts. And sometimes the only difference between a bandit king and a noble lord was which side of the pardon you happened to be standing on when the political winds shifted. You leave the forests of Europe behind and sail now to the South China Sea, to waters where piracy isn't just a criminal enterprise but a fully developed naval power with fleets that number in the hundreds of ships and crews in the tens of thousands. The year is 1807, and you're about to meet perhaps the most successful pirate in human history. Not Blackbeard, not Captain Kidd, but a woman who commanded more ships and more men than most national navies, who negotiated treaties with the Chinese emperor as an equal, and who retired peacefully to run a gambling house after a career of maritime terror. Her name was Zheng Yi Sao, which simply means wife of Zheng Yi, though history would remember her as Qing Shi, and her story challenges every assumption about gender, power, and crime in the early 19th century. She was born around 1775, probably into poverty, and worked on a floating brothel in Canton before marrying Zheng Yi, an established pirate captain, in 1801. Some accounts suggest she was captured by pirates and married her captor. Others say she negotiated marriage terms that gave her equal partnership in his fleet. Either way, when Zheng Yi died suddenly in 1807, possibly in a typhoon, possibly in battle, the records are unclear, his widow didn't weep quietly and retire. Instead, she maneuvered to take control of the entire pirate confederation her husband had assembled, beating out his male relatives and rival captains to become the supreme commander of what was essentially a floating empire. Under her leadership, the pirate confederation grew to staggering proportions. At its peak around 1809, Zheng Yi Sao commanded between 1,500 and 1,800 ships, crewed by somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 pirates. To put that in perspective, the entire British Royal Navy at the height of its power during the Napoleonic Wars had around 1,000 ships and 140,000 men. This woman controlled a maritime force that rivaled the official navies of major European powers, all organized as a criminal enterprise operating in Chinese coastal waters. The Confederation was divided into 6 fleets, each identified by colored flags: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green, with the red flag fleet being the largest and most powerful under her direct control. What made Zheng Yi Sao remarkable wasn't just the scale of her operation, but how she organized it. She implemented a comprehensive legal code for her pirates, a set of written rules that governed everything from the distribution of plunder to the treatment of captives. Pirates who deserted or disobeyed orders faced death. Rape of captives was forbidden and punishable by execution, though forbidden in this context meant captives had to be purchased from the common plunder fund if a pirate wanted to take them as wives, a system that was probably less consensual than the word wives suggests. Plunder had to be registered and fairly distributed according to rank and role. It was organized crime in the most literal sense, structured, regulated, and professionally managed. The Pirate Confederation operated like a state within a state, controlling coastal regions and rivers, taxing fishing villages and merchant ships, issuing safe passage permits to those who paid tribute, and fighting off Chinese imperial forces that tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to destroy them. Villages under pirate protection had to pay regular fees but were left unmolested and even protected from other pirates and bandits. Merchants could purchase passes that guaranteed safe passage through pirate-controlled waters. It was a protection racket on a geographic scale that included hundreds of miles of coastline and thousands of square miles of ocean. Historians still argue whether this system was more stable and reliable than the corrupt and inefficient official Chinese bureaucracy of the period, which is a damning commentary on the Qing dynasty's governance problems. The Chinese imperial government tried everything to defeat Zheng Yi Sao. They sent naval expeditions that were outmaneuvered and defeated. They attempted blockades that the pirates simply sailed around or broke through. They offered amnesty to pirates who would defect, with limited success. The problem was that Zheng Yi Sao's confederation was simply too large, too well organized, and too popular among the coastal population to be defeated militarily. Many coastal residents preferred the predictable tribute system of the pirates to the unpredictable extortion of corrupt imperial officials. Some pirates were local boys who'd grown up in coastal villages and maintained family connections, making the pirate fleets partly a local defense force against outside interference. By 1810, the situation had reached a stalemate. The imperial government couldn't defeat the pirates, but the pirates couldn't expand further inland. Both sides were exhausted from years of warfare, and both had incentives to negotiate. This is where Zheng Yisao demonstrated political skills that rivaled her military ones. She opened negotiations with the Chinese authorities, playing off different officials against each other, demanding terms that would allow her forces to surrender with honor and security rather than facing execution or imprisonment. The negotiations took months, with Zheng Yisao showing the patience and strategic thinking of an experienced diplomat rather than a criminal warlord. The final amnesty agreement in 1810 was remarkably generous. Zheng Yisao negotiated pardons for nearly all of her followers. Over 17,000 pirates received amnesty, keeping most of their personal wealth. Many were even incorporated into the Imperial Navy, turning pirates into official military forces. Her chief lieutenant and lover, Zheng Bao, was made a colonel in the imperial forces and given a noble title. Zheng Yisao herself received an aristocratic title, was allowed to keep a personal fleet of ships and a small private army, and retired with her accumulated wealth intact. She'd fought the Chinese Empire to a draw, and then negotiated a peace that left her rich, titled, and free, an outcome that almost no other pirate in history has achieved. She spent her remaining years running a gambling house and brothel in Canton, occasionally offering her services as a consultant to the Chinese government on piracy matters, because who better to advise on stopping pirates than the woman who'd commanded history's largest pirate fleet? She died peacefully in 1844 at around 69 years old, having survived not only a career of maritime crime but also the dangerous transition back to legitimate society. Most pirates who retire peacefully do so because they weren't very successful and thus weren't worth hunting down. Zheng Yisao retired peacefully because she'd been so successful that the government found it cheaper and easier to co-opt her than to destroy her. Her story reveals something important about crime and power in pre-modern societies. The line between criminal organization and legitimate government was often thinner than we imagine. Zheng Yisao ran what was essentially a state. She had military forces, a legal code, a taxation system, territorial control, and diplomatic relations with other powers. The main difference between her confederation and a legitimate government was simply recognition and legitimacy. And even that difference dissolved when the Chinese Empire decided it was pragmatic to recognize her organization and absorb it into the official structure. One day, she was China's most wanted criminal. The next, she was receiving honors at court. Power, it turns out, has a way of rewriting the categories of legal and illegal when it's convenient. You stand now on the deck of a red flag junk, the South China Sea stretching in every direction, and you can almost see the hundreds of ships that once sailed these waters under Zheng Yisao's command. She remains largely unknown in Western history, overshadowed by far less successful male pirates who've captured popular imagination through books and films. But in terms of actual power, actual success, and actual impact, no pirate in history comes close to matching her achievement. She commanded tens of thousands of followers, controlled vast territories, fought an empire to a standstill, and retired rich and respected. Do you remember the bandit kings of Europe from earlier, negotiating their way back to legitimacy? Zheng Yisao did the same thing, but on a scale that makes them look like small-time operators. She was the pirate queen who won, and that's the rarest kind of criminal story of all, the one that ends not with execution or imprisonment, but with comfortable old age and peaceful death. Sweet dreams, and maybe be grateful that modern shipping lanes are slightly more secure than the South China Sea in 1809. You travel now to the mountains of Persia, to a fortress perched impossibly high on a rocky peak called Alamut, which means eagle's teaching or eagle's nest in the local dialect. The year is 1090, and you're about to enter the stronghold of one of history's most misunderstood and feared organizations, the Nizari Ismailis, better known in the West as the Assassins, a word that entered dozens of languages directly from their name. This is the story of how a persecuted religious sect turned political murder into an art form, how a charismatic leader named Hassani Saba built a cult of killers whose reputation terrified kings and caliphs, and how legends of hashish-drugged fanatics and secret gardens of paradise became intertwined with the reality of medieval political violence in the Islamic world. Hassani Saba was born in Persia around 1050 into a Twelver Shia family, receiving an excellent education in theology, mathematics, and astronomy. He eventually converted to Ismaili Islam, a minority sect that differed from mainstream Sunni and Shia Islam on matters of succession and religious authority. The Ismailis were politically marginalized and often persecuted by the Sunni Seljuk Empire that controlled much of the Middle East. Hassan saw an opportunity to create a base of power for his faith, and in 1090 he infiltrated Alamut Castle through a combination of subterfuge and conversion of the garrison, taking control without a battle. From this mountain fortress, he would direct a campaign of targeted political assassination that would last for decades and create a legend that persists nearly 1,000 years later. The term assassin that became associated with Hassan's followers comes from hashishin, which medieval European crusaders understood to mean hashish users, giving rise to legends that the killers were drugged into religious fervor. Modern historians are skeptical of this etymology and the drug connection. It's more likely the term was either a corruption of asasiyon, meaning people who are faithful to the foundation, or simply a derogatory term applied by their enemies. The hashish story probably originated from Marco Polo's accounts written nearly 200 years later, mixing rumor, propaganda, and misunderstanding into a narrative that was too exotic and sensational to fact-check carefully. Medieval sources loved the idea of drugged killers acting under cult control because it explained behavior that otherwise seemed inexplicably fanatical. What Hassan actually created was a highly disciplined organization that used assassination as a precise political tool. The Nizari Ismailis were vastly outnumbered by their enemies, the Sunni Seljuk Empire, various Crusader states, even other Shia groups that considered them heretical. They couldn't field large armies, couldn't win conventional wars, but they could strike terror into their enemies through targeted killings of key leaders. Hassan's assassins, called Fedayeen, meaning those who sacrifice themselves, were carefully selected, rigorously trained, and deployed with specific political objectives. This wasn't random murder. It was strategic elimination of threats and enemies, conducted with a level of planning that would impress modern intelligence agencies. The assassin's methods became legendary. A Fedayeen would infiltrate an enemy court, sometimes spending months or years building a cover identity as a servant, guard, or even trusted advisor. When the moment came, they would strike in public, often using a dagger, making no attempt to escape because escape wasn't the point. The public nature of the killing was the message. Historians still argue whether these killers were genuinely willing to die for their faith, or whether they believed Hassan's promises of paradise if they died in service, but the effect was the same. Kings and generals lived in constant fear because wealth and guards couldn't protect against someone willing to die to reach them, someone who might already be in their inner circle waiting for the signal. One of their most famous victims was Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, stabbed to death in 1092 by an assassin disguised as a Sufi mystic. The killing sent shockwaves through the Islamic world because Nizam al-Mulk was one of the most powerful men in the Middle East, protected by armies and bodyguards, yet a single determined killer reached him, Other victims included Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, stabbed by two assassins posing as Christian monks in 1192, showing that the Nizari Ismailis would strike Crusader targets as readily as Muslim ones when political interests aligned. The list of victims and near victims reads like a who's who of medieval Middle Eastern politics, and the number of plots that were simply threatened but never executed was probably even more significant than those carried out. Hassani Sabah himself reportedly never left Alamut Castle after seizing it, ruling his organization from his mountain fortress for 34 years until his death in 1124. He lived an ascetic life, executing even his own sons for various infractions, presenting himself as an incorruptible religious figure devoted entirely to the cause. The castle became the center of a network of fortresses across Persia and Syria, each one a center of Ismaili power and a training ground for Fedayeen. The organization persisted for nearly 2 centuries, surviving Hassan's death and continuing under a succession of leaders who maintained the strategy of using assassination as political leverage. The myths that grew around the assassins included stories of a secret garden at Alamut, where Hassan would drug young recruits and let them experience paradise, beautiful gardens, flowing fountains, willing maidens, every pleasure imaginable, then tell them this was the afterlife that awaited if they died carrying out his orders. It's a compelling story that appears in Marco Polo's accounts and was repeated by European writers for centuries. Modern scholars are deeply skeptical that any such garden existed. The castle ruins show no evidence of elaborate gardens, and the story has all the hallmarks of Orientalist fantasy, the exotic Eastern cult leader using drugs and sensual pleasures to control naive followers. The reality was probably far more mundane. Devout believers motivated by genuine faith, political conviction, and loyalty to a charismatic leader, not unlike countless other religious and political movements throughout history. The Nizari Ismaili state finally fell to the Mongols in 1256, when Hulagu Khan's army besieged and captured Alamut and systematically destroyed the network of Ismaili fortresses. The Mongols were less impressed by assassination as a threat because their leadership was decentralized and their generals were comfortable with high casualties. Killing one Mongol commander just meant another would take his place. The psychological weapon that had worked so effectively against feudal Muslim and Crusader states failed against the Mongol war machine. The Ismaili territories were destroyed, their libraries burned, and their populations scattered, though the Ismaili faith itself survived and continues to this day as a legitimate branch of Islam, with millions of followers worldwide, who are probably tired of the Assassin's Creed video games and every other pop culture reference to their ancestors. The legacy of the assassins extends far beyond their actual historical impact. They gave the world a word that appears in virtually every language, assassin, meaning a politically motivated killer. They contributed to Western fantasies about the exotic and dangerous Orient, the cult leader controlling drugged killers from a mountain fortress. They influenced countless stories, games, films, and books, usually bearing little resemblance to the historical reality. Historians still argue about how many assassinations they actually carried out versus how many were falsely attributed to them, whether their religious devotion was genuine or cynically manipulated by leaders, and whether they were terrorists, freedom fighters, or simply one faction among many in the chaotic politics of the medieval Middle East. You stand now in the ruins of Alamut Castle, destroyed so thoroughly by the Mongols that little remains beyond foundations and scattered stones. The fortress that once struck fear across empires is now a tourist destination where Iranian families picnic on summer weekends. The Fedayeen who struck from shadows are now video game protagonists. The organization that perfected political assassination as a tool of the weak against the powerful has been reduced to legends about drugged killers and secret gardens. Perhaps that's fitting. The assassins understood better than most that perception and fear could be more powerful than armies, that a reputation for ruthless efficiency could accomplish more than actual violence, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one your enemy imagines you have, rather than the one you actually possess. Reality becomes legend, legend becomes myth, and somewhere in between lies the truth that no one can quite pin down anymore, which is exactly the kind of obscurity that might have pleased Hassani Sabah himself. You return now to the darker corners of medieval Europe, to the villages and towns where something even more sinister than organized banditry or political assassination was taking place, the work of what we would now call serial killers. Individuals who murdered repeatedly not for profit or politics, but from some internal compulsion that medieval people struggled to understand or explain. These weren't the famous criminals whose names echo through history books. These were the forgotten monsters who prowled when psychology didn't exist as a discipline, when the only explanations for inexplicable evil were demonic possession or literal transformation into monsters. You're about to meet killers whose crimes were so disturbing that their communities could only make sense of them through legends of werewolves and witches. In the village of Bedburg near Cologne, in the late 16th century, yes, we're pushing the edge of our medieval time frame again, but the mentality is thoroughly medieval, lived a farmer named Peter Stump, also known as Peter Stubb, or by various other spellings in records that weren't particularly concerned with standardization. Peter was a prosperous farmer, a widower with 2 children, respected in his community, and seemingly ordinary. But between approximately 1582 and 1589, someone was committing horrific murders in the countryside around Bedburg, children disappearing, travellers attacked, bodies found mutilated beyond recognition, partially consumed as if by animals. The community was terrified, and explanations turned inevitably to the supernatural because how else could such things happen? Peter Stump was eventually captured, tortured, and confessed to being a werewolf who had murdered and cannibalized at least 14 children and 2 pregnant women over a period of 25 years. His confession, extracted under torture that included being stretched on the rack, included claims that the devil had given him a magical belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf, that he had committed incest with his daughter, and that he had eaten the hearts of his victims. He was executed in 1589 with spectacular brutality, flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers, arms and legs broken on a wheel, then beheaded and burned. His daughter and his mistress were also executed for complicity. A gruesome woodcut pamphlet describing his crimes circulated throughout Europe, making the werewolf of Bedburg famous as a cautionary tale about evil walking among us. Here's where modern historians get uncomfortable. The confession was obtained through torture, which is notoriously unreliable for extracting truth. The supernatural elements, the magic belt, the transformation into a wolf, are obviously impossible. Some scholars suggest Peter Stump was indeed a serial killer whose crimes were real, but whose confession was embellished with supernatural elements to make the horror comprehensible to a 16th century audience. Others argue he might have been innocent, scapegoated during a period of panic, possibly suffering from a medical condition like hypertrichosis that gave him an unusual appearance, or simply unlucky enough to be accused during a witch hunt atmosphere, when torture would produce whatever confession the authorities wanted to hear. Historians still argue about what actually happened in Bedburg, but the case reveals something important about medieval and early modern crime. The lack of forensic science meant that serial killers could operate with relative impunity. There was no concept of criminal profiling, no understanding of psychological compulsion, no systematic way to connect crimes across time and space. A killer who moved between jurisdictions, who varied their methods, or who simply got lucky could murder for years before being caught. And when they were caught, The explanations available were religious or supernatural rather than psychological, transforming human monsters into literal monsters to make their crimes explicable. Another case that horrified medieval Europe comes from 15th century France, where a man named Gilles Garnier was accused and convicted of being a werewolf who murdered and cannibalized children near the town of Dole. The case has uncomfortable similarities to Gilles de Rais, but Garnier was a peasant rather than a nobleman, which meant he received no mercy and no aristocratic protection. He confessed under torture to murdering 4 children, describing in detail how he killed them and ate their flesh. He was burned alive in 1574. Another supposed werewolf destroyed by fire, the medieval answer to crimes they couldn't otherwise explain. The werewolf trials of medieval and early modern Europe, concentrated particularly in France, Germany and Switzerland, may have been the era's way of processing serial murder before the concept existed. When we read these trial records stripped of their supernatural language, we often find descriptions of what we now recognize as serial killer behavior, targeting vulnerable victims like children, mutilating bodies, returning to crime scenes, sometimes cannibalism or necrophilia. The transformation into a wolf might have been the only framework available to explain someone who seemed human but committed atrocities associated with wild animals. In Italy during the 1540s, a man named Vincenzo Verzenni murdered at least 2 women and attempted to kill several others, drinking their blood and mutilating their bodies. He wasn't labelled a vampire in official records, but the blood-drinking element of his crimes fed into vampire folklore that was already well established in European peasant culture. Verzenni was eventually caught, not through any clever detective work, but simply because someone witnessed one of his attacks. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, dying in prison years later, but his case illustrates how such killers could operate. He wasn't a powerful nobleman who could hide behind status, just a labourer who murdered when opportunity presented itself, and he was only caught through luck rather than systematic investigation. The medieval period and early modern era produced serial killers whose names we'll never know, whose crimes went unsolved, who died peacefully in their beds because no one connected the disappearances in their wake to a single perpetrator. The combination of high infant mortality, dangerous travel conditions, wild animals, disease, and the general brutality of pre-modern life meant that unexplained deaths and disappearances were common enough that patterns were hard to detect. A child who disappeared might have been taken by wolves, fallen in a river, died of plague, been kidnapped by raiders, or been murdered by a serial killer, and distinguishing between these possibilities was often impossible. Consider the case of Thüring of Waldshut, mentioned briefly in medieval chronicles as a murderer who killed travellers near the Swiss-German border in the 13th century. The records are fragmentary, a line or two mentioning his execution, nothing about his victims or methods. How many people did he kill? We don't know. Why did he kill? No one recorded his motives. Was he robbing his victims or killing for other reasons? The chronicles don't say. He's just a name attached to murderer, one of probably thousands of similar cases where medieval record-keeping captured the fact of execution, but not the story behind it. The concept of investigating serial murder in any systematic way didn't really develop until the 19th century, with the advent of modern policing, forensic science, and psychology. Medieval authorities could execute someone they caught in the act or someone who confessed, but they had no tools for identifying patterns, building profiles, or conducting the kind of investigations we now take for granted. DNA evidence, fingerprints, criminal databases, psychological profiling, forensic pathology, none of these existed. A clever killer, or even a moderately cautious one, could continue indefinitely. This lack of investigative capability meant that the serial killers we know about from the medieval period are likely the tip of the iceberg, the ones who were caught through luck, or whose crimes were so obvious they couldn't be ignored. For every Peter Stump who was captured and became infamous, how many others died quietly, their crimes attributed to wolves or demons or accidents? For every noble like Gilles de Rais whose crimes were eventually exposed, how many others protected by status and wealth were never investigated at all? The dark reality is that we'll never know, and that uncertainty is perhaps more unsettling than any specific case. You walk now through a medieval village at dusk, hearing mothers call their children inside, watching as shutters close against the night. The fear is palpable even in memory. Fear of the dark, of the forest, of strangers, of the possibility that someone in the village itself might be the monster everyone whispers about. Medieval people lived with fears that we've largely left behind, not because human nature has changed, but because we've developed tools to investigate, apprehend, and explain the darkness in ways they never could. The monsters are still human, but now we can at least sometimes catch them before they become legends, and that's progress of a sort. Sleep tight and be grateful for forensic science, criminal psychology, and streetlights. Simple modern miracles that make the night slightly less terrifying than it once was. You step now through the marble corridors of the Vatican, through the palaces of bishops and the chambers of cardinals, into spaces where golden crosses gleam above heads plotting murder, where men who claim to speak for God engage in poisonings, assassinations, and crimes that would make secular criminals blush. The medieval and Renaissance Catholic Church produced some of history's most spectacular criminals, protected not despite their positions but because of them, wielding spiritual authority as a shield against earthly justice. You're about to meet the corrupt popes and cardinals who turned the papacy into a criminal enterprise, who sold salvation and murdered rivals, who fathered armies of illegitimate children and lived in luxury that would scandalize modern megachurch pastors who merely own private jets. The papacy wasn't always corrupt, of course, but certain periods stand out as particularly spectacular in their depravity. The pornocracy, or rule of the harlots, in the 10th century, saw a series of popes controlled by powerful Roman families, particularly the Theophylact family and their daughter Marozia, who was rumoured to be the mistress, mother, and grandmother of different popes, a family business model that confused genealogy with theology in ways that made succession planning particularly awkward at Sunday dinner. Pope John XII, who reigned from 955 to 964, was accused by his enemies of turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel, of toasting the devil, of invoking pagan gods while gambling, and of various murders. He allegedly died at age 27, either from a stroke while in bed with a married woman, or beaten to death by the woman's husband, depending on which scandalous account you prefer. Moving forward to the Renaissance, you encounter the Borgia family, whose very name became synonymous with papal corruption. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for America, a coincidence that Spanish historians probably wish carried more symbolic weight, and his papacy was a masterclass in nepotism, simony, and political murder. Alexander openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, appointing his son Cesare as a cardinal at age 18, despite Cesare having no religious vocation whatsoever and considerably more interest in warfare and political intrigue. His daughter Lucrezia became a pawn in political marriages, though modern historians have largely absolved her of the poisoner reputation that Renaissance gossip attributed to her. She was probably more victim than villain in the Borgia schemes. Cesare Borgia, while technically not a pope himself, deserves mention as perhaps the most criminal cardinal in history. He resigned his cardinalship to pursue military and political power, becoming the model for Machiavelli's The Prince, and conducting a campaign of conquest across central Italy that involved assassinations, betrayals, and strategic murders that would impress modern organized crime bosses. He allegedly had his brother Juan murdered and thrown into the Tiber River to eliminate a rival for their father's favour and political support. He imprisoned and possibly ordered the murder of his brother-in-law. He was handsome, charismatic, ruthless, and completely amoral. Basically every quality that makes for a successful Renaissance politician and a terrible Christian role model. The Borgia family's approach to papal politics involved liberal use of poison, leading to rumours about a secret Borgia poison called Cantarella that supposedly left no trace and allowed for convenient deaths of wealthy cardinals whose estates would then escheat to the papacy. Historians still argue whether Cantarella actually existed or was simply arsenic rebranded with a more exotic name, but the Borgia's enemies certainly died with suspicious frequency. When Pope Alexander VI himself died suddenly in 1503 after attending a dinner party, rumours immediately circulated that he'd accidentally consumed poison intended for a cardinal guest. Divine justice, some said, though modern historians suspect malaria or another fever rather than poison. It would be poetic if Alexander died from his own methods, but reality is rarely that neat. Before the Borgias, you had Pope Benedict IX in the 11th century, who allegedly sold the papacy itself in 1045, accepting payment to abdicate in favour of his godfather, who became Pope Gregory VI. This created such a scandal that it took a church council to sort out who was actually pope, eventually deposing all three claimants, Benedict, Gregory, and a third pope who'd been elected in the confusion, and starting fresh. Benedict had originally become pope around age 20 through family connections and bribery, and his reign was reportedly so debauched that he was driven from Rome by angry citizens multiple times before finally selling the office. He's the only pope to have sold the papacy, which is the kind of unique distinction that doesn't get highlighted in official Vatican histories. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, wasn't personally murderous but was so militaristic that he personally led armies into battle wearing armour, earning him the nickname the Warrior Pope. He's famous for commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and for beginning construction of St. Peter's Basilica, but he financed these projects partly through aggressive military campaigns and the sale of indulgences, those religious get-out-of-purgatory free cards that would eventually help trigger the Protestant Reformation. Julius represents a different kind of papal criminality, not personal murder and debauchery, but the use of spiritual authority to fund political and military ambitions, treating the church as a secular kingdom rather than a spiritual institution. The sale of church offices, simony, named after Simon Magus, who tried to buy spiritual power in the Book of Acts, was endemic throughout the medieval church. Cardinals and bishops purchased their positions, then recouped their investment by selling lower offices and extracting fees from the faithful. The Archbishop of Mainz in the early 16th century was simultaneously bishop of multiple dioceses, a situation that required papal dispensation that cost him a fortune, which he then tried to recoup by selling indulgences, which led Martin Luther to nail his 95 Theses to a church door and accidentally start the Reformation. It's a reminder that world-changing religious movements sometimes begin as reactions to straightforward financial corruption. The Inquisition deserves special mention, though we'll explore one particularly notorious inquisitor in detail soon. For now, understand that while the Inquisition was created to combat heresy, it quickly became a tool for political persecution, personal vendettas, and wealth confiscation. Accused heretics had their property seized by the church, creating a financial incentive to find more heretics. The accused had limited rights to defense, couldn't face their accusers, and could be tortured to extract confessions. Historians still argue about the actual numbers. The Spanish Inquisition probably executed between 3,000 and 5,000 people over several centuries, Far fewer than Protestant propaganda claimed, but still thousands of deaths for religious nonconformity, which is thousands too many by any modern standard. Cardinals weren't just corrupt administrators, some were active criminals. Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, allegedly had his cousin Giulio's eyes torn out in a fit of jealousy over a woman. Cardinal Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, who became Pope Leo V, was reportedly so debauched that his election to the papacy at age 37 inspired the comment, "God has given us the papacy, now let us enjoy it." He died from malaria, but his lifestyle of hunting parties, elaborate banquets and theatrical performances left the papal treasury bankrupt and the church's moral authority in tatters. The sheer scale of papal corruption becomes clear when you realize that the Protestant Reformation was partly a reform movement against this criminality. Luther's complaints weren't just theological abstractions. They were responses to a church that had become a protection racket selling salvation, a political entity murdering dissenters, and a family business enriching dynasties. The Catholic Counter-Reformation that eventually responded involved genuine reforms precisely because the accusations were largely accurate. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century implemented changes specifically designed to address simony, nepotism, and corruption, tacit admission that these problems had become systemic. You stand now in St. Peter's Basilica, that magnificent achievement of Renaissance architecture, and you might reflect that it was partly built with blood money, indulgences sold to fearful Christians, funds extracted through corrupt church offices, wealth confiscated from those accused of heresy. The building is beautiful, the art is transcendent, but the financing came from systems that would make modern organized crime look relatively ethical by comparison. Historians still argue whether these corrupt church leaders genuinely believed in Christianity or simply used it as a convenient framework for power and profit. But perhaps that question misses the point. People are remarkably good at convincing themselves that their interests align with divine will, that their crimes serve higher purposes, that they're entitled to what they've taken. The corrupt popes and cardinals probably believed they were serving God, even as they murdered, stole, and betrayed everything Christ supposedly taught. That capacity for self-deception might be their most frightening quality of all, because it suggests that no amount of religious authority, spiritual education, or theological sophistication protects against basic human corruption when power and wealth are on the table. Sleep well and maybe reflect that at least modern religious leaders are usually only guilty of tax evasion and sexual scandals rather than actual assassination and empire building, which counts as progress of a sort. You remain in the realm of religious crime, but travel now to Spain at the height of its imperial power, to a period when the Catholic Church wielded the Inquisition like a weapon against anyone who threatened religious orthodoxy or merely looked at a priest the wrong way. At the center of this machinery of persecution stands Thomas de Torquemada, a name that has become shorthand for religious fanaticism, systematic torture, and the dark side of absolute conviction. He was the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, appointed in 1483, and during his 15 years in that position, he transformed the Spanish Inquisition into perhaps the most efficient persecution apparatus in European history, a system that would continue operating for over 3 centuries after his death. Torquemada was born around 1420 into a converso family, Jews who had converted to Christianity possibly under pressure, which adds a layer of psychological complexity to his later zealous persecution of conversos suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Some historians suggest his extreme orthodoxy was partly compensation for his own family background, an attempt to prove his Christian credentials beyond any possible doubt by being more Catholic than the Pope. Others argue this explanation is too simplistic, that Torquemada was a genuine believer who saw Jewish and Muslim presence in Spain as existential threats to Christian purity, Either way, his appointment as Grand Inquisitor by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1483 gave him power to reshape Spanish society according to his rigid vision of religious conformity. The Spanish Inquisition under Torquemada wasn't primarily concerned with witchcraft like the later witch trials in northern Europe. It focused on conversos and moriscos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of continuing to practice their original faiths in secret. This suspicion wasn't entirely unfounded. Many conversions were forced or coerced by social pressure, discrimination, and occasional violence, so some conversos did indeed maintain Jewish practices privately while outwardly conforming to Christianity. But Torquemada's Inquisition went far beyond investigating genuine cases of false conversion. It became a system of paranoid surveillance where denunciation was encouraged, where evidence requirements were minimal, and where torture was routinely employed to extract confessions. The procedures Torquemada established would become templates for inquisitorial justice across Catholic Europe. Accused heretics were arrested and held in Inquisition prisons, often for months or years before trial. They weren't informed of the specific charges against them or allowed to face their accusers. The identity of witnesses was kept secret to encourage denunciation without fear of reprisal, though this also made false accusations nearly impossible to defend against. Defense attorneys were appointed, but they worked for the Inquisition and often encouraged their clients to confess rather than mounting vigorous defenses. The entire system was designed to produce confessions rather than determine truth. Torture was approved by church doctrine as a means of extracting truth, with the convenient theological reasoning that saving a soul from heresy justified inflicting pain on the body. Torquemada's Inquisition employed the standard medieval torture methods, the strapado, where victims were suspended by their arms tied behind their backs with weights attached to their feet, dislocating shoulders, the rack, which stretched bodies until joints separated, water torture, pouring water down the victim's throat to simulate drowning. The torturer would carefully record everything, noting how many turns of the rack, how long the water torture lasted, what the victim said during the process. It was bureaucratic brutality, systematic suffering documented in ledgers that still survive in archives, reading like accountants' records except they're cataloguing screams instead of expenditures. Historians still argue about the numbers, as they always do with historical atrocities. Earlier estimates, influenced by Protestant propaganda, claim tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands executed during Torquemada's tenure. Modern historical research using actual Inquisition records suggests around 2,000 people were burned at death during his time as Grand Inquisitor, with perhaps 2,000 more burned in effigy after fleeing or dying before trial. That's still 2,000 people killed for religious nonconformity, 2,000 families destroyed, countless others imprisoned or tortured, and an entire society terrorized into conformity through fear. The actual numbers matter less than the system Torquemada created, one that would continue long after his death, executing thousands more and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee Spain over the following centuries. The auto da fe, the public ceremony where sentences were announced and carried out, became spectacles of religious theatre. Torquemada would oversee these events, wearing his Dominican robes, sitting in judgment as penitents were paraded before crowds, their sentences announced, their fates sealed. Those who confessed and repented might receive mercy, strangulation before burning, or imprisonment instead of death. The unrepentant were burned alive, tied to stakes, while crowds watched and priests urged them to final confession even as the flames rose. It was meant to be edifying, a demonstration of the Church's power over heresy and sin, but it was also entertainment, religious violence as public spectacle, and thousands would attend these events as they might attend festivals. Beyond the executions, Torquemada's Inquisition imposed sanbenitos, penitential garments that convicted heretics had to wear publicly, marking them and their families with shame that could last generations. Even after serving their sentences, former heretics and their descendants were barred from various professions and positions, creating a permanent underclass of the religiously suspect. The atmosphere of suspicion Torquemada fostered meant that peculiar dietary habits, washing on Saturdays, refusing to eat pork, or any behavior that might suggest Jewish practice, could lead to denunciation and investigation. It was totalitarian religious surveillance centuries before totalitarianism had a name. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, and the same year Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabella, completing the Reconquista, Torquemada convinced the monarchs to issue the Alhambra decree, expelling all Jews from Spain unless they converted to Christianity. Estimates suggest between 40,000 and 100,000 Jews left Spain, abandoning property, businesses, and homes to escape forced conversion or Inquisition persecution. It was ethnic cleansing driven by religious justification, and Torquemada was its primary architect. A similar expulsion of Muslims would follow in subsequent decades. Spain was purifying itself of religious diversity, creating Catholic uniformity through violence and exile, and Torquemada provided the theological and administrative framework that made it possible. Torquemada himself lived an austere life. He was genuinely ascetic, sleeping on a wooden plank, eating simply, rejecting personal luxury even as he wielded enormous power. He travelled with a guard of 50 armed men and 250 mounted soldiers, not from a taste for pageantry, but from genuine fear of assassination attempts by those whose families he'd destroyed. He was aware he was hated, aware that countless people wanted him dead, yet he continued his work with absolute conviction that he was serving God. That combination of personal austerity and systemic cruelty is somehow more chilling than the corruption of the Borgias. At least Alexander VI was a hypocrite, pursuing obvious personal gain. Torquemada appeared to genuinely believe in what he was doing, which makes him harder to dismiss as simply evil and forces uncomfortable questions about the dangers of absolute conviction. He died in 1498 at age 78 in the monastery of Avila, still serving as Grand Inquisitor, though increasingly frail. The Spanish Inquisition he created would continue until 1834, operating for over 3 centuries, executing thousands more, imprisoning tens of thousands, and creating an atmosphere of religious paranoia that stunted Spanish intellectual and cultural development. Other European nations would occasionally invite the Inquisition to establish branches, though nothing quite matched the Spanish version's longevity and systematic nature. Torquemada's name became a byword for religious persecution, his legacy so dark that even the Catholic Church doesn't try to defend him anymore. You stand now in a plaza in medieval Spain, imagining the smoke rising from an auto-da-fe, hearing the prayers and screams mixing together, watching as Torquemada presides over the spectacle with absolute conviction that this horror is holy work. Historians still argue whether religious persecution like the Inquisition should be judged by modern standards or understood in its historical context, where religious uniformity was seen as essential to social order and heresy was treated like treason. But perhaps some acts transcend their context. Some cruelties are wrong in any era, and the systematic torture and murder of people for their beliefs stands condemned regardless of how normal it seemed to perpetrators. Torquemada was a criminal who wore the robes of religious authority, who killed in God's name, who built a system of persecution that outlived him by centuries. That he believed he was righteous makes him more dangerous, not less. A reminder that the worst atrocities are often committed by those absolutely convinced of their own virtue. Sleep tight, and maybe take comfort that at least modern Western societies have mostly agreed that torturing people for their religious beliefs is generally frowned upon, which represents progress, even if we had to wade through rivers of blood to reach that obvious conclusion. You find yourself now in the shadows of medieval courts and castles where loyalty is currency and betrayal is business, where oaths sworn on sacred relics are broken before the sun sets, where today's trusted advisor becomes tomorrow's assassin. The medieval world ran on personal bonds, vassals to lords, knights to kings, subjects to sovereigns, and when those bonds shattered, the results could topple kingdoms and rewrite history. You're about to meet the traitors and kingslayers, the backstabbers and oath-breakers whose names became synonymous with treachery, whose crimes were considered somehow worse than straightforward murder, because they violated the fundamental social contracts that held the medieval world together. The archetypal medieval traitor might be Judas Iscariot, not medieval himself, obviously, but his betrayal of Christ became the template against which all other betrayals were measured. Dante placed traitors in the lowest circle of hell, frozen in ice, which tells you where medieval culture ranked treachery in its hierarchy of sins. But actual medieval history provided plenty of candidates who needed no biblical comparison to establish their villainy. Guy Fawkes, arrested in 1605 while guarding explosives beneath the Houses of Parliament during the Gunpowder Plot, has achieved a strange modern fame, but earlier traitors were far more successful in their treachery and far more devastating in their impact. Consider Edmund of Langley's son, Edward, Duke of York, who was involved in multiple plots and counterplots during the Wars of the Roses, though he eventually died fighting for the king at Agincourt, loyalty regained too late to erase earlier betrayals. Or better yet, consider Richard III's alleged murder of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, which if true represents not just murder, but the ultimate familial betrayal, an uncle eliminating his brother's children to seize the throne. Historians still argue whether Richard actually killed the princes or whether they died from other causes or even survived, but the accusations stuck so thoroughly that Shakespeare made it the centerpiece of his play 5 centuries later, and Richard's reputation never recovered. Going back further, you encounter the story of Edric Striona, an Anglo-Saxon nobleman in early 11th century England, whose name became a byword for treachery. Edric betrayed King Ethelred the Unready, then switched sides to support the Danish invader Swene Forkbeard, then switched back to Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside, then betrayed Edmund to the Danes under Knut, who eventually had him executed in 1017, probably because even Knut realized that someone who betrays everyone eventually betrays you. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes Edric's death with barely concealed satisfaction, noting that he was killed very justly for his many treacheries. Medieval chroniclers loved ironic justice, and a traitor being killed by someone he'd helped into power was too perfect to pass up. The murder of Thomas Becket in 1170 represents treachery of a different sort. 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury in his own cathedral, allegedly responding to King Henry II's frustrated exclamation, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The king probably didn't literally order the murder, but the knights interpreted his angry words as permission to act, creating a treachery that was simultaneously against the archbishop, against the church, and against proper feudal protocol where orders should be explicit rather than implied. Henry did public penance for the murder, walking barefoot through Canterbury while being whipped by monks, because even a king couldn't escape the taint of such spectacular treachery against the church. In Scotland, the murder of King James I in 1437 involved a conspiracy of nobles who literally pulled up floorboards to reach the king hiding in a sewer vault, stabbing him repeatedly while his wife and attendants tried desperately to protect him. The assassins were caught and executed with particular brutality, tortured with hot irons over several days before finally being killed. because regicide was the ultimate treachery, striking at the divine right of kings and threatening the entire social order. The medieval punishment for treason reflected its severity. Being hanged, drawn and quartered meant being dragged behind horses, partially hanged, disemboweled while alive, beheaded, and having your body cut into pieces displayed in different locations. It was meant to be so horrific that no one would dare commit such crimes, though obviously it didn't work as a deterrent. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 in Florence combined assassination, political treachery, and spectacular failure in equal measures. The Pazzi family and their allies attempted to murder Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Mass in Florence Cathedral. They succeeded in killing Giuliano, stabbing him 19 times, but Lorenzo escaped with only minor wounds. The people of Florence, rather than supporting the conspirators as they'd hoped, rallied to the Medici. The backlash was swift and brutal. Conspirators were hunted down and killed, some hanged from the Palazzo Vecchio windows, others torn apart by angry mobs. The Archbishop of Pisa, who'd supported the conspiracy, was hanged in his episcopal robes from the palace window, an image that shocked Catholic Europe but didn't save him from Florence's rage. You need to understand that medieval treachery wasn't always condemned. Successful traitors who overthrew unpopular rulers could be celebrated as saviours. Henry Bolingbroke deposed his cousin Richard II in 1399, taking the throne as Henry IV, and historians still argue whether this was justified removal of a tyrant or naked usurpation. Richard II's own deposition and probable murder in captivity made him either a martyred king or a failed ruler who got what he deserved, depending on which side you supported. Medieval politics didn't have a clear distinction between legitimate succession and successful treachery. Power went to whoever could seize and hold it, and history was written by the victors, who naturally portrayed their own treachery as justified and their enemies' loyalty as foolish. Historians still argue about the motivations behind medieval betrayals. Were they driven by personal ambition, genuine grievances, political necessity, or simply opportunism when chance presented itself? The line between pragmatic political maneuvering and criminal treachery was often defined retroactively based on who ended up winning. If your betrayal succeeded and you established a stable rule, you were a reformer or liberator. If you failed, you were a traitor whose name would be cursed for generations. This retrospective moral judgment makes evaluating medieval traitors particularly difficult. We're often reading accounts written by or for the people who defeated them, which isn't exactly unbiased historical record. The concept of loyalty itself was more complex in medieval society than modern ideas of patriotism suggest. Vassals owed loyalty to their immediate lord, who owed loyalty to their lord, creating chains of obligation that could conflict when different levels of the hierarchy went to war with each other. If your lord rebelled against the king, were you being loyal by supporting your lord or treacherous by opposing the king? Medieval people genuinely grappled with these questions, and many betrayals happened in grey zones where competing loyalties made any choice technically treasonous to someone. The knights who murdered Becket thought they were serving their king. Henry II thought they'd betrayed proper feudal behaviour. The church thought they'd committed sacrilege. Everyone was right from their own perspective, which is how medieval treachery often worked. The fate of traitors' families adds another dark dimension to medieval treachery. When someone was executed for treason, their lands were typically confiscated, their titles revoked, and their families impoverished or worse. The children of traitors were attainted, legally corrupted so they couldn't inherit property or titles, condemned to poverty and shame for their parents' crimes. This collective punishment was meant to deter betrayal by threatening not just the individual but their entire lineage, though it also created generations of embittered descendants who often sought revenge when opportunities arose, perpetuating cycles of treachery and counter-treachery that could last centuries. You stand now in a medieval throne room watching the swearing of oaths, the elaborate ceremonies binding vassal to lord, knight to king, subject to sovereign. The words are formal, ancient, invoking God and saints as witnesses. But you know that many of these oaths will be broken, that loyalty is conditional on power and self-interest, that the medieval world, for all its talk of honor and fealty, operates on ruthless pragmatism beneath the ceremonial surface. The traitors and kingslayers weren't aberrations, but inevitable products of a system where personal bonds held society together, and breaking those bonds could be either the worst crime imaginable or the smartest political move, depending entirely on whether you succeeded. Medieval treachery teaches an uncomfortable lesson that modern societies haven't entirely learned, that loyalty is often situational, that oaths are only as strong as the power enforcing them, and that the difference between a traitor and a founding father often comes down to nothing more than whether you win or lose. Sweet dreams. And maybe reflect that at least modern governments have mostly moved beyond executing people's children for their parents' crimes, which is progress even if we still struggle with the fundamental problem of how to maintain social trust when self-interest constantly tempts people toward betrayal. You've travelled far through the centuries now, through castles and forests, across seas and mountains, into throne rooms and torture chambers, meeting criminals whose names still echo through history and whose crimes still capture imaginations centuries after their deaths. You've seen nobility and poverty, religious leaders and outcasts, organized crime and lone killers, all committing acts that horrified their contemporaries and continue to fascinate us today. Now, as we approach the end of this journey through the darkest corners of medieval and pre-modern history, you might be wondering what it all means, why these stories persist, what they reveal about human nature, and how the medieval world's approach to crime shaped the societies we inhabit today. The legacy of medieval criminals extends far beyond their individual stories. They shaped legal systems, influenced folklore, created archetypes that persist in modern culture, and forced societies to develop new ways of thinking about crime, punishment, and justice. The serial killers who were explained as werewolves eventually led to more sophisticated understandings of psychology and criminal behavior. The bandit kings who controlled territories forced governments to develop more effective law enforcement and centralized authority. The pirates who commanded fleets demonstrated that criminal organizations could rival states in power and sophistication. The corrupt church officials who abused spiritual authority contributed to the Protestant Reformation and the eventual separation of church and state in many societies. Consider how many modern institutions emerge partly as responses to medieval crime. The development of professional police forces, forensic science, criminal law, trial procedures, prison systems, all of these evolved from medieval societies struggling to deal with criminals they couldn't effectively investigate or apprehend. The presumption of innocence, the right to face your accusers, protection against torture and cruel punishment, these legal principles developed partly in reaction to inquisitorial abuses and medieval torture practices. We live in society shaped by lessons learned through centuries of trial and error, often tragic error that cost innocent lives and allowed guilty ones to escape justice. The criminals you've met tonight also reveal something about how societies construct narratives around evil. Gilles de Rais becomes inseparable from Bluebeard folklore. Vlad the Impaler merges with vampire legends. Elizabeth Bathory transforms from possible serial killer to definite blood-bathing countess. Sawney Bean may be entirely fictional, yet his story persists as if historical. The assassins become drugged fanatics in an exotic mountain fortress rather than a persecuted religious minority using asymmetric warfare tactics. Historians still argue about the boundaries between fact and fiction in these stories. But the legends often reveal more about what societies fear than the historical facts do. What terrified medieval people? Powerful criminals who escaped justice through status and wealth, like Gilles de Rais operating with impunity for years. Organized crime that operated as a parallel society, like the Thuggee in India spanning generations. Religious authorities abusing their power, like Torquemada, turning faith into a weapon of persecution. Betrayal from within, like the countless traitors who shattered the bonds of loyalty that held feudal society together. Foreign threats operating with alien logic, like the assassins striking from mountain fortresses. These fears haven't disappeared, they've simply evolved to fit modern contexts. We still fear powerful criminals escaping justice, organized crime infiltrating legitimate society, authorities abusing power, betrayal from trusted insiders, and threats from groups whose motivations we struggle to understand. The criminals who achieved notoriety weren't necessarily the most prolific or successful. They were often the ones whose crimes aligned with cultural anxieties in ways that made their stories spread. Peter Stump, the Werewolf of Bedburg, becomes famous partly because his story fed into fears about hidden evil in ordinary communities and transformation of humans into monsters. Zheng Yi Sao, the Pirate Queen, fascinates because she violated multiple categories simultaneously: woman, criminal, successful leader, challenging assumptions about gender, power, and crime. Locusta the Poisoner represents fears about invisible threats: poison in the wine, death that looks like natural causes, the trusted servant who is actually an assassin. Historians still argue about how to balance historical accuracy with cultural significance when studying these figures. Do we focus on documenting what actually happened, even when sources are fragmentary and biased? Or do we study the legends and myths that grew around these criminals, treating those stories as historical artifacts themselves that reveal truths about the cultures that created and perpetuated them? The answer is probably both. We need rigorous historical research to understand what we can verify, but we also need to understand why certain stories persist and evolve while others are forgotten. The punishments medieval societies inflicted on captured criminals reveal their own form of brutality that sometimes matched or exceeded the original crimes. Being burned alive, drawn and quartered, broken on the wheel, impaled, flayed, these executions were designed not just to kill but to terrorize observers into obedience. Public executions were entertainment, moral instruction, and political theatre simultaneously. Yet for all their spectacular cruelty, these punishments didn't effectively deter crime. The medieval world remained violent and crime-ridden despite brutal consequences for those caught. It turns out that certainty of punishment deters crime more effectively than severity of punishment, a lesson modern criminology has confirmed, but that medieval societies never quite learned. The criminals you've encountered tonight operated in a world with far less surveillance and investigation capability than modern societies possess. No cameras, no databases, no forensic science, no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no professional police forces conducting systematic investigations. A clever criminal, or even a moderately careful one, could operate for years before being caught, and many were caught only through luck, betrayal, or becoming so brazen that even medieval society's high tolerance for violence was exceeded. This relative impunity meant that those who were caught and punished represented only a fraction of actual criminals. We've explored the visible tip of an iceberg whose full extent will never be known. Yet medieval societies weren't entirely helpless against crime. They developed informal networks of surveillance through tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. They used reputation and shame as social control mechanisms. They employed collective punishment where entire families or communities were held responsible for individual crimes, encouraging self-policing. They created elaborate rituals of oath-swearing and sacred vows that bound people through religious fear even when secular enforcement was weak. These systems weren't perfect and often targeted innocents while missing guilty parties, but they represent creative responses to the challenge of maintaining order without modern technology. The question of whether medieval criminals were fundamentally different from modern ones is interesting to consider as you settle deeper into sleep. Human nature hasn't changed. People still murder, steal, betray, and abuse power. But the contexts that enable crime have evolved dramatically. A medieval serial killer like Peter Stump could operate for decades because no one connected isolated murders into a pattern. A modern serial killer leaves forensic evidence that can be analyzed, digital traces that can be tracked, patterns that profilers can identify. Medieval organized crime like the Thuggee persisted for centuries, partly through hereditary recruitment and codes of silence. Modern organized crime faces infiltration by undercover agents, surveillance technologies, international law enforcement cooperation. The romantic legends that grew around certain criminals, Robin Hood, the charming bandit who robbed from the rich, Zheng Yisao, the pirate queen who commanded fleets, even Vlad the Impaler transformed into a vampire count, reveal something about how we process historical violence. Distance softens horror into entertainment, tragedy transforms into myth, and complex humans reduce to archetypes. The criminals you've met tonight were real people, probably no more or less complicated than people today. But time has simplified them into characters, their crimes into stories, their victims into statistics that don't haunt our dreams the way they haunted their families. Do you remember when we began this journey, standing outside Gilles de Race's castle, contemplating the crimes that medieval nobility could commit with impunity? We've traveled through centuries and continents since then, meeting criminals of every type, nobles and peasants, religious authorities and heretics, organized syndicates and lone killers. The common thread isn't their methods or motivations, but simply the human capacity for cruelty when opportunity presents itself and consequences seem distant or absent. Medieval societies struggled with this reality just as modern societies do, creating legal systems, religious teachings, and social structures trying to channel human behavior toward cooperation rather than predation. As you drift now towards sleep, the story's fading like mist as your consciousness releases its grip on medieval horrors. Perhaps there's comfort in recognizing that for all our modern problems, we've made genuine progress in some areas. We've mostly stopped torturing people for their beliefs, though not everywhere and not entirely. We've developed legal systems that at least attempt fairness and presumption of innocence, though they remain imperfect and often biased. We've created institutions that investigate crimes systematically, rather than relying on confessions extracted through torture. We've established principles that punishment should be proportional and humane, rather than spectacular and cruel. These achievements are fragile and inconsistent, requiring constant defense against regression, but they represent centuries of painful learning from mistakes like those you've encountered tonight. The criminals of medieval times are dead, their empires fallen, their fortresses ruined, their names surviving mostly in history books and sleepy YouTube videos. Their victims are long gone too, their suffering ended, their stories mostly lost, except for occasional fragments preserved in trial records and chronicles. What remains is the reminder that human societies are constantly struggling between our better and worse natures, that crime and justice evolve together in complicated dances, and that the distance between civilization and brutality is sometimes thinner than we'd like to believe. But also, and this is worth holding on to as you slip into dreams, that progress is possible, that societies can learn from their mistakes, that the arc of history bends slowly but sometimes toward justice, even if the path is littered with the failures and horrors we've explored together tonight. The night deepens now, and the medieval world recedes further into the shadows of history where it belongs. You've walked with monsters, but you've returned safely to the present, to a world that, while imperfect, has learned at least some lessons from those dark centuries. The criminals we've met tonight, Gilles de Rais in his Loire Valley castle, Vlad impaling his enemies in Wallachia, Sawney Bean in his Scottish cave, whether real or imagined, Elizabeth Bathory in her Hungarian fortress, Locusta poisoning for emperors in Rome, the thuggy strangling travellers on Indian roads, bandit kings ruling their forest kingdoms, Zheng Yisao commanding her pirate fleets, the assassins striking from Alamut, serial killers transformed into werewolves, corrupt popes selling salvation, Torquemada building his apparatus of persecution, traitors breaking sacred oaths. They're all returning to the past now, their crimes complete, their punishments mostly served, their stories told one more time to one more audience seeking the strange comfort of historical horror safely distant from our lives. Your breathing slows, deepens, becomes rhythmic as sleep approaches. The faces fade, the castles crumble, the screams quiet, and what remains is simply the gentle sound of your own breath, the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blankets, the safety of your present moment. History's monsters can't reach you here. The medieval darkness has passed. The criminals sleep in their graves, their power dissolved by time, their terror transformed into tales that send modern listeners gently into peaceful rest. The most notorious criminals of medieval times have given up their secrets, shared their stories, and now release you to your dreams. May they be pleasant ones, filled with light rather than darkness, with justice rather than crime, with peace rather than violence. The past is past, the stories are told, and the night welcomes you with open arms into sleep's gentle embrace. Sleep well, dear listener. The history has been explored, the criminals have been examined, and now there's nothing left but rest. Tomorrow will bring its own stories, its own challenges, its own moments of light and shadow, but tonight you've travelled far enough, learned enough, and it's time simply to let go and drift into the peaceful oblivion of sleep where no medieval monsters can follow. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through history's darkest corners. Until we meet again in some future night when sleep calls and history whispers its stories, rest peacefully knowing that you are safe. The world has changed, and the criminals of medieval times remain where they belong, in the past, powerless, and finally, blessedly, silent. Silent, 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 silent,